There we go, perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here. As Pete said, my name is Sina, and I am here to talk to you about thinking about all users, thinking about all the different types of users that the stuff that we create they might encounter, and they might have differing abilities. So what does that really mean, right? But before we get started, I generally go over this general rule, which is because some of you saw me coming up here with a cane. That means I happen to be blind. So if I ask you some questions, which I will do during this talk, nodding or raising your hand is not going to really work out too well for me or for you. And so we're going to dispense with that. So if I ask you a question, just be verbal if you're able with your response, like yes. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, that was a test of the no nodding rule, so we're off to a good start. You'll see some hashtags at the bottom of the slides. One is for the conference, of course. My Twitter handle is on there. I'll just read it out for accessibility best practices, SINABAHRAM. And you'll also notice A11Y. Has anyone seen this hashtag before? All right, and so it stands for accessibility. It's a numeronym, right? And it's the 11 letters that are removed from the word, the CCESSIBILIT. I18N is internationalization, L10N is localization, etc., right? Constraints on old file systems have their effects even to this day. And so that, by the way, I just talk about that hashtag because it's a great opportunity. It's a great group of people and tribe of people online to really learn from, and if you have questions about this stuff, to talk about. Just a little bit about myself. I run a company called Prime Access Consulting, or PAC, P-A-C for short. We do a ton of work in the inclusive design space, and I'm going to be explaining what that is, and accessibility. I'll be talking about all of those definitions. And we work with everybody from museums to startups to venture funds to anybody, universities, on any types of issues where we can use technology to make things better, make physical interfaces better for everybody. I happen to be blind, but we concentrate on everything from hearing to differences of language to differences of identity, and how do we make these environments more inclusive. So that's what we do, from mobile websites, augmented reality, block-based programming environments, 2 and 3D environments, you name it. How do we make this stuff more accessible? So that's what I get to play with on a daily basis. A little bit in terms of background, when I was very young, I lost most of my vision. This was around the age of 7 or so. I didn't have perfect vision to start off with, but I was playing, I had more than I do now. I was playing tennis against the backboard, just practicing serving, that kind of thing. I missed one of the shots, my face did. And so that, basically it resulted in me losing most of my vision in my right eye. So you can think of me as mostly blind, right? I have some light perception, but I read Braille, I travel with a cane. I have a screen reader talking to me in my ear, which I'm going to be demoing for you guys in a few minutes. I'm not just up here listening to music as I give this presentation, right? So it's reading me my slide contents as I'm talking to you, right? So long story short, went to school for computer science. So I have undergraduate and graduate degrees in comp sci, ABD, and a PhD in computer science. As I decided to leave the PhD program and go off and run the company and work on trying to make these various technologies more inclusive. But my research concentrated on multimodal ways of exploring spatial information, things like bar charts, maps, graphs, that kind of thing. How do you use a little bit of machine learning, touchscreen technologies, voice recognition to explore that stuff in a multimodal way, so that if you can't see or you can't hear, there's other senses, there's other modalities we can use to present that kind of information and thereby make it better for everybody, not just somebody who needs speech or who needs large print or who needs it zoomed in. Does that make sense? Awesome. So, I wanted to just briefly go over what we're going to talk about. We're going to define a few terms, get some definitions out of the way, get on the same page, and then go over a little bit about just why this matters, why are we talking about this stuff, right? Go into some digital accessibility concepts that I think is very relevant for everybody in the room and things that I'm very passionate about, right? And then do the fun stuff, right? Like demo an assistive technology, show you some things that I think are pretty interesting that I hope you are too, and then conclude with some final thoughts, right? So a couple of definitions, right? The first one is accessibility. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but what does it really mean, right? And so it's the ability of all people to use a product, a service offering, right, a place independent of disability. And this is really important, that the definition of accessibility is rooted in this reference to disability. So we should probably ask, being technical folks, therefore, what is disability, right? So disability is the consequence of an impairment. This can be sensory, like olfactory, vision, like myself, hearing, mobility, the ability to use your feet for bipedal locomotion, you name it, right? It can be mental or cognitive in nature, right? Dyslexia, ADHD, that sort of thing. It can be emotional or depression, anxiety, any of these things. So all of these things can, and combinations therein, can combine to form some form of impairment. Some type of impairment. And how we think about this and how we think about people who have some form of impairment is the topic that I want to talk to you a little bit about today. So there's two classic ways of thinking about disability, but I want to really stress something before we get started in this. There's an entire field of critical disability studies. Wikipedia, Reddit, and Twitter are your friends. Go forth and really dig deep into this rabbit hole if you like. I'm not trying to present these two as the only two ways of thinking about disability, but they are two useful ways of kind of contrasting some very popular beliefs around it, right? So the first way is the medical model. I think most of us are familiar with this. You break your arm, you go to the doctor, hopefully it heals, right? You get a cast, that sort of thing. What happens, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like we have medical science, we can improve things. What happens when that doesn't work? What happens when you can't restore the vision, or you cannot restore the hearing, right? Or you cannot restore the spinal cord function, right? So then we view in the medical model as the person having a disability. We view them as broken or impaired in some way, right? Now, if we contrast this with the social model of disability, it's pretty stark, because in the social model of disability, we don't consider the individual as being disabled. We consider the environment as being disabling, right? The fact that you're juggling crutches and can't open the door because there's no automatic door opener is not your fault for needing crutches. It is the fault of the building for not having a door opener. Does this make sense? So these are two different ways of thinking about disability. So how do we make our environments less disabling, right? And that's where we get into inclusive design. Some people may have heard of universal design, yes? A few, there was a few. And so inclusive design basically is this design methodology that we use at the beginning. This can be for software, hardware, architecture, you name it. Anything where we're making stuff, especially stuff that will be used by people, right? And it puts the person at the heart of the design process, right? It's really as simple as that. It's building in things like being adaptive into our interfaces, flexibility, and not assuming a nominal or perfect user. Not assuming my user has perfect vision, therefore I can use color coding to convey information. My user has perfect reading ability, therefore a paragraph of highly technical text is appropriate, right? It's allowing us to think about how users will have differing needs and then making our things adaptable and flexible enough to accommodate that. Does that make sense? Okay, some common examples of this are things like curb cuts, of course, right? That's the very common example that's used. You guys are familiar with this, the little ramp that goes down from a sidewalk. So if you're a wheelchair user, you don't have to hop the curb. But who uses that the most? It's parents with strollers, right? It's the people with luggage at the airport. So even though it's critical for one audience, it is helpful or augmentative for everybody. That's the kind of emergent benefit you get from this. It's not just for those people, quote unquote, right? It's not for other people. It's for everybody, even though it's critical for some people. And by the way, quick thing with curb cuts. It's an example of something launching into production with a few bugs in it, right? We're pretty familiar with that, I would say, right? So like, what is the consequence of the first curb cuts? Well, they didn't have those bumps on them. You guys know what I'm talking about, the little domed dots that you see on curb cuts, right? Sometimes that's colloquially called foot braille, right? There are no hidden messages, I have checked. That is a lost opportunity for city planners. And so the idea there is, why are those there? Well, what was happening was they were really smooth. And imagine like a parkway, like a driveway in a parking garage kind of thing. There's a really gentle incline. So if you're a blind pedestrian, you're traveling along and you could be in the middle of the street without knowing it. Now, if you combine this with silent electric cars, it turns out that Teslas hurt when they hit you. So what do we do about that? We don't go, oh snap, guess we're not doing curb cuts anymore, right? We iterate and we fail forward. So this is an idea of, we're not always going to get it right the first time. Let's please not let perfection be the enemy of the good. Does that make sense? Yeah. Awesome. All right. So In terms of why this matters, I just wanted to quickly go over a few things here. So the first thing I lead off with is, it's simply the right thing to do, right? This is a quote from Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, right? He says, when we work on making our devices accessible for the blind, I don't consider the bloody ROI. I don't consider the return on investment. He was getting needled by an investor at one of the board meetings a few years back, and this was about as outbursty as Tim Cook, gets. Like this is considered very out of the norm for him. And so this was a really important message, though, because they tend to walk this talk. No one's perfect, but Apple really does tend to walk this talk in terms of accessibility. There's tens of thousands of dollars of assistive technology built into every single iPhone, Apple Watch, Apple TV, MacBook, etc., right? They have screen reading built in, screen enlargement, things for switch-based users. I'll talk about that in a little bit. There's a lot of stuff built in there. And they've been walking this talk of it's the right thing to do. Not an accessibility add-on after the fact, but let's make the environment inclusive. So I think that's really important. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is the numbers simply don't lie. Over 1 billion people in the world have some form of impairment or disability. 110 to 190 million of them have a severe impairment. And these numbers are not going down, they're going up. The frank reason, just to be perfectly blunt with you, is babies aren't dying. And as a result, that's good, right? But they may grow up with one or more disabilities. And so this is the nature of humanity. And you want to fast forward a little bit from here, you can look at places like Japan and parts of Asia where they have more elderly populations. Over the age of 35, your chances of getting a disability is 1 out of 2. Okay? 1 out of 2, so that's 50%. So this is not something that just affects a small portion of the population. So if you're more of a numbers person, this is another way of thinking about why this stuff is important. And then lastly, and I don't like to concentrate on this a lot, there's plenty of other people that do, it's legally mandated, especially in this country, in Europe, in Canada now, Australia. This is not something that is a light mandate anymore, right? There's things like the ADA, there's 508, there's all of these other education-related legislation, the CVAA. So there's all these legal reasons for doing it. And frankly, if you do the work of accessibility and making our things inclusive, you get a lot of this compliance for free out of that kind of effort, and you end up getting a massive ROI in terms of more customers and everything. It's just simply mathematically, it makes sense to do this now. It's not an additional burden, and every time someone does a proper risk analysis, it comes out to actually being, being profitable and being the right thing to do. So does that make sense? Okay, awesome. So, in terms of digital accessibility, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about some different ways that persons that use assistive technologies, what are those examples of those different ways, right? So I talked briefly about a screen reader, and I'll not talk too much about that one because I'll be demoing that for you in just a minute. But there's also things like a Braille display, right? So this is a refreshable Braille display, is a device that you put in front of you, usually in front of your keyboard, and it has little pins that are actuated up and down, and so it can make Braille appear under your fingers, right? This is especially helpful for somebody who's, let's say, deaf-blind, right? Who has no ability to hear the screen reader, but they still want to be able to use the computer through a screen reading software, so they can use a Braille display. It's also helpful for proofreading. Some people prefer it for code, that sort of thing, right? For low vision, there's things like screen enlargement, text enlargement, zooming in, right? Color mappings, and dark mode is becoming very popular these days, right? Inverted color modes, because all of these things are ways of adapting our interfaces so that people with various abilities or various requirements can use them. Does this all make sense? Okay. In terms of physical impairments, you have things like sticky keys. Ever hit the shift key a couple of times on your keyboard and the dialog box comes up about enabling sticky keys? Well, that's really important for somebody with very limited dexterity, because it lets you mash a bunch of keys on the way to the one that you're going to, but it will ignore all of those, right? It lets you use a keyboard with one hand only, because it gives you enough time to do shortcuts. Like if you want to do Control-C, you can press the Control key, then move your finger over and press C, if you don't have the ability to do that with one hand. So sticky keys is something that's built into our operating systems and is really, really, really helpful for people who need that, right? There's one-handed keyboards, there's hardware keyboards that perform this job. Those are really fun to play with if you've never played with one. There's things like eye tracking, voice-based programming, all of these different things. And the real takeaway from this slide is to show there's all this stuff out there in the world. We don't have to necessarily worry about that. There's other people working on those kinds of things. What we need to worry about is making the web content that we create or that our scripts create accessible and programmatically extensible in ways that all of these different technologies can take advantage of it and can facilitate. We don't have to be an expert in how, for example, Stephen Hawking used a computer. He was a switch user, so he had a sensor on his jaw muscle. He would actuate his jaw muscle, and he would author astrophysics books by a cursor moving across the screen, and he had autocomplete before a lot of us did, right? That's where that kind of technology came from. Suggestions, texting on your phone came from deaf people communicating over TTY. Even the typewriter, right, came out of that. The Alexander Graham Bell with the phone. We have all of these examples of technologies that have come out of solving problems in the disability space. We don't have to be experts in that stuff. What we need to do is make sure the code we're writing, the websites, the dashboards, the different interfaces that we're creating and that we're buying are accessible so that they can facilitate that level of access. Does that make sense? Okay. So, in terms of web accessibility, who here has heard of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short? Cool, all right. So it's a set of functional requirements, published by the W3C and the World Wide Web Consortium. And it's a set of requirements that essentially lays out success criteria for what it means for a website and also, for example, for a mobile app to be accessible. It's not everything that can be done. There's always more, but it's a really good set of rules. There's plenty of resources on this. I spend a lot of time working with everybody from developers to senior management on things like WCAG conformance and how you get there and how you make things accessible. But I just want to mention it because it's a good set of rules, and I think it should be on everyone's radar in terms of somebody saying, okay, well, what does it mean for something to be accessible? Most definitions, eventually, all of those roads come back to WCAG, okay? So that's something that should be on your radar. There's WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. Just so you know, 2.1 is the update. It's a full superset of 2.0. So if you're ever looking at something and you see WCAG 2.1, it's simply the more up-to-date rules. There's 3 levels, A, AA, AAA. Almost everybody conforms to AA when they're trying to conform. That's where it's at. So WCAG 2.1 AA means that, all right, we're doing most of those things that allow our website, mobile app, etc., to be accessible to the widest possible audience. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. And I'll show you some consequences of that when we dive into the demo here in a second. A couple of tips and tricks just so I can, I have a few minutes with you guys. I just want to make sure I cover some of these because we see a lot of this. When we're using, fonts and colors and that sort of thing, it's perfectly fine to use colors to convey information. We are visual beings. We use color all the time. Nothing wrong with that. It's just don't use color alone to convey information. When you say the required stuff is the stuff in red, that's where it's not cool, right? But if you have a red star or red asterisk, and you also use the required attribute in HTML, now we're good. Does that difference make sense? Okay, so that's really critical, right? With images and graphics, have people heard of alt text? Yeah, use it, right? So when we have an IMG, it needs to always have an alt attribute. Sometimes that alt can be empty, that's fine, but always have that, right? It's really, really critical. These are very little things that we can do. There's characters of code, but it will save people hours of use time. Things like tables, right? Do folks in the room, how many people speak HTML in this room? Yes? Okay, cool. So the TH tag for tables, how many people use that? Okay, so that's really critical because when you make that first row of your table a T head and you use those TH tags, that's what then allows someone like me to come along, use that table. I can be 30 rows down, but I'll know what column I'm in. I'll know what row I'm in because those table headers matter, right? So this stuff, this like little semantic stuff is really, really, really important because sometimes it's just a few characters of code. It makes all of the difference in the world. It doesn't change the way it visually looks, so it's easy for us to ignore it, right? It's not out of malice. It's just, we just sometimes forget. But it's really critical to get that stuff right because it makes a significant impact when people are using the interface in a different way, like with a screen reader. Does that make sense? Okay, and remember, golden rule of HTML. Every single thing on the web starts out as being 100% accessible. It's everything we do to it that makes it inaccessible, right? Like, that div is accessible. When you decide to put an image behind it and put an on-click on it and pretend it's a button instead of using an actual button tag, that's when we have a problem, right? So when we use those semantics that HTML provides, you're already 90% of the way there. Does that make sense? Okay, so a couple of other things. There's an accessibility checker when we're making Office documents. Make sure to use that. It's built into Word and PowerPoint. It gives you some head-ups, call-outs for exactly the kind of things that I'm talking about: heading order, lists, links, that sort of thing. It warns you about that, right? And lastly, with respect to PDF, always save as a PDF if you can instead of printing to a PDF so the text content makes it through. And consider EPUB. How many people are familiar with EPUB in this room? Okay, that's awesome. So, EPUB's fantastic. It's standards-based. You can do things like MathML inside of it, which makes the math accessible. You can do entire textbooks in it. It's a fantastic format, and I just like to encourage people to use it. All right, so let's dive in to what I think is some of the fun stuff. So forgive me for a second while I escape out of this. I will do that. I will plug this 1/8 inch in. Here we go. There we go. If I can get some volume on that. There we go. Cool. All right, so this is how I use a computer. So we can, come to the command line, right? Whatever, like open up WSL, right? So this is the Windows subsystem for Linux. Whatever, we can run top, right? vmstat, fs, right, that kind of thing, right? We can, there's meminfo, et cetera, right? So pretty straightforward, really easy to do. However, I am told that's a little fast, so we can slow that down. That's about 950 to 1,000 words per minute. Let's slow that. 29%, 25%. How's that? We good? All right, don't be shy, all right? It's important that you understand what it's saying, so let me know. All right, cool. So this is not 950 words a minute. This is probably around, let's listen. It's probably like 120, 130 words per minute. I tend to talk a little fast, so I'm probably up around 150. I think Valley Girl's 180, if I'm not mistaken. So that's concatenative speech. What you're hearing here is just a text-to-speech synthesizer. It's the screen reader that I happen to be using, and it's reading me the screen. So if we go over like, here's Notepad. I'm just using Alt-Tab to navigate around because obviously not using the mouse, right? We can, right? So I can do that. Notice the difference between this and this. You notice the difference there? Right? So it's a higher pitch, right? So we're not going to waste 3 syllables of my life with the word capital, right? So multimodal exploration, multimodal information is really important here, right? Like I only have so much time, and I already got to deal with inaccessible experiences. The last thing I need is extra words, right? So that idea of using the audio channel effectively is super important, right? We can navigate phonetically. Tango, hotel video. Right, we can navigate, for the geeks in the room. Character 105, character 1, character 32. Which actually does come in handy when like reading assembler output and stuff, so, that was useful. You can do things like... Cut, control plus X unavailable T. So we got a lot of information there. Cut, control plus X, unavailable T. So it told me it was unavailable, not because I don't have anything highlighted, nothing to cut. It told me the mnemonic in the menu, T, that's the letter you press in the menu to quickly do that thing, right? It told me the global shortcut key, Control X, right? And of course it told me what it was, cut, right? Does that make sense, all of those pieces of information? So that is the kind of stuff, this is just native. The person who wrote the Notepad application in Windows did not need to know about screen readers. They just needed to know, look, I populate the following strings and magic happens. And the magic is accessibility APIs and all this other stuff that runs in the background. If you got questions on it, I'm happy to geek out with it, with you about it. But like, they didn't have to know that. They just had to know to fill in the appropriate metadata so that the interface was accessible. Does that make sense? Okay, so and notice like it didn't say things like grayed out. It said unavailable. So it's giving me the semantics of what I need to know, not reading me the visual thing, right? Because there's a difference, and this is something HTML tries to bring home to us, right? There's a decoupling between presentation and content, and proper inclusive design and accessibility really just hammers that point home, that we should decouple these two concepts. So
no selection.
Let's
Selected
do...
object. Title is Spinnaker Summit. Start JAWS Perfect Spinnaker Wikipedia.
Here we go. So I thought this would be cute. So this is like the Spinnaker Wikipedia page, right? Obviously different different concept, more around nautical and sailing, right? So I wanted to just highlight a couple things. Headings on the web. People are familiar with this concept, yes? Okay, cool. What are headings used for? Somebody want to shout that out? Come on, guys. Say again? Metadata? That's keep going. Structure. I heard structure. That's fantastic. Are headings used to make text bigger? They are. Should they be? No. Right? And so what happens is, we'll sometimes use headings to make text bigger. That's not their point. Their point is structure, like was said over there. So, chapter, like the title of the book, that's your level 1 heading. All of your chapters, those are your level 2 headings, your H2s. All those subsections, those are your H3s, right? So the navigation for the website could be the H2. All of the subnavs can be your H3, right? You have a list, you have a fleet of servers that you're managing. Servers is your H2. All of the individual servers could be H3. If you do that kind of semantic structure, we're literally talking about 9 characters of code here, right? Less H3 greater, less slash H3 greater, right? At its most basic form. If you can do that, then you can allow someone to use like a screen reader to do stuff like this. I can navigate the structure like this. One second. There we go.
Missing contents, operation, types of Spinnaker, symmetric Spinnaker, asymmetric Spinnaker, link at nomenclature, link at the code 0, link at flight to Spinnaker, link at heading. Right?
So all I'm doing is navigating by heading. I'm able to jump over tons of content just with one key, right? I can go backwards.
The code's nomenclature,
right? I can navigate by level.
The code 0, flight to Spinnaker.
Those were the H3s. Let's see if there's an H4 around here.
No more headings at level.
Right, so there wasn't one at H4, so you can explore the structure. And imagine if this was a 500-page document, I could fly across it. If that little piece of code is missing, it might look okay, it might be in a bigger font, it might be bolded, right? It looks like a heading, but it's not actually a heading. Now we're stuck arrowing.
Heading left,
arrow, until we get to the next section, right? Which is really arduous and incredibly frustrating. Does that make sense? So headings are important, right? Simple thing. All right, let's keep going.
Blank.
Sorry, lost audio, restoring.
Title is management.
Here we go. So we'll come back to that one. Let's do, here's a simple Google search. I just did something simple, mounting an NTFS and Linux, right? Okay, so
main region.
I could jump to the main region with one keystroke. I didn't have to read all that stuff about Gmail and Google search and do I feel lucky or anything, right? I just jumped to the main section. How did I do that? Because there's a main tag that they're using here, main/main, and I was able with one keystroke, because my screen reader gives me that, to jump to it. For the geeks in the room, how many people here are familiar with VI, the text editor? Okay, so you know how there's an insert mode and a browse mode in VI? I have that on the web. That is how I use documents. So when I'm in insert mode, it's just like you using the computer. I can type, it types my username. I can type, it types my password. But if you think about it, it would be really nice to jump to that username field, to navigate by heading, to navigate by link, to navigate by button or whatever. That's where I can put it in browse mode, and then every single key on my keyboard has a purpose. B is buttons, C is combo boxes, D is different element that I'm on right now, Q is the main section because they were running out of letters at that point. T is table navigation, G is graphic, right? I have all of these keys on my keyboard to fly across a web page as long as the semantics are there. And it's exactly like VI's insert versus browse mode. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So it's just going to sleep, sorry about that. It must really suck not to be able to see the screen. Sorry. All right, so here we go. I just wanted to show one example here. So like, somebody put that in an ARIA live region, and so I get to hear the cookie warning every time I load the page, which is fantastic. So little niceties of the web. So what I wanted to highlight here was there are some headings on this page, so I can do this. Cool, and then I can jump to the next heading.
2 answers, heading level 2.
Which is awesome. So I know there's 2 answers, but here's the deal. I can't navigate between the answers. So if I hit H again,
your answer heading level 2.
It jumps to that area. So we jump over all of the answers. So to read these answers, and sometimes, this is a simple one. Imagine, you guys have seen these threads when there's like 30 nested comments. And all right, so you're arrowing down. Blah, blah, blah. Then you keep arrowing down.
share. Link improve answer set link graphic test link visual growth 15.5 equals admit I assume that under
And then you find the next one. And then you don't know if it's nested because it's not a UL that would have been trivial to set up here. So a little bit of HTML would have gone a super long way. Does this make sense? Okay, so like I can read this at 1,000 words a minute. That's not the hard part. That problem's been solved. The problem is, if that little bit of semantics is not there, I'm spending way more time than you browsing the page. Okay, let's quickly go to another example. Here's just a GitHub page. I don't want to pick on GitHub too much, especially since, in all seriousness, guys, they're working on making this more accessible. They've been pushing code actually on a bi-weekly basis, and we're working with them as a client also to make GitHub more accessible. So I want to give them props, seriously. But I'm going to pick on them a little bit, and this is something they're already working on, which is that here's an issue. This is a project I helped run. It's called Coyote. It's an open source platform for authoring visual descriptions, especially in the art world. So we have thousands of visual descriptions of paintings and artworks, and it's got Dublin core schemas and all that stuff. Happy to geek out with you if you're interested in this kind of thing. But if we jump by heading here, okay, cool. So we know where we are, but we can't navigate by issue, right? Now, it used to be that these would each have a checkbox, and I would use that as my trick, and I would navigate by checkbox, but if you're not logged in, the checkboxes don't populate, and so therefore, because this isn't using proper table semantics or grid markup, I'm not able to navigate by issue, so I have to arrow down.
Search at position, link, issue, new issue, link 70, link 2, author button, labels the project, milestone design, sort button, groups, link button, 201, number 400.
Okay, found one. Right? And that's browsing GitHub issues, okay? It doesn't matter if you're a genius at Ruby. It does not matter if you know the answer for what the Nginx conf needs to be, right? The one-liner that needs to fix the problem, right? That's not the point. The point is that if it's taking you 15, 20, 30 extra seconds per little micro task, like simply finding the issue, that's where it becomes really exclusionary. Somebody could be absolutely brilliant, let's say blind screen reader user, but not be able to get a job being productive in this space, not because they don't have the knowledge or because they can't do the hacking. That's frankly the easy part. It's the just using a little dashboard or using a little web interface to get some of the project management stuff done. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, let's look at one other thing really quick.
Spinnaker Wikipedia group, main region, LAM.
So
copyright title is Lambda management.
Here's just setting up a Lambda on AWS. Something that should be relatively easy to start off with. I just wanted to start with let's just jump to the main section.
Main region.
Okay, so it has that. That's good. By the way, not all of the pages have this. I found one that did.
Navigation region.
Okay.
List of 3 items.
Okay.
Same page link lambda. Same page link functions. Same page link unavailable current page create function.
Sure. Not really very clear, but fine. We'll go with that.
List navigate plan. Heading level 1 create function.
Okay.
Heading level 1 link info. Heading level 5 choose one of the following.
So we jumped from a level 1 heading to a level 5 heading, so it's not a logical heading structure, right? Let's just keep going.
List of 3 author from scratch.
Sure.
Radio button not checked.
Okay. Oh, there's radio buttons. Well, I know how to navigate by radio buttons, so let me navigate by radio buttons.
Radio button checked 2 of 3.
Well, okay, but it didn't give me a label.
Radio button not checked 3 of 3.
No idea what I'm checking. Now I can down arrow.
Deploy sample lambda.
Okay, sure, and then I have to go back up
Radio button
and
not
maybe
checked.
check that one, right? Let's just keep going though.
The list plan. Heading level 2 blueprints.
Okay.
Heading level 2 link info.
Sure.
Export button unavailable. Filter by tags and attributes or search by keyword.
Okay.
Edit.
Sure. What if I want to do stuff with speech?
S-P-E-E-T-H. Virtual piece.
And then do I
DD/tagging button.
DD/tagging button? Cool. I don't know what that does. Let's just keep going.
List of 9 unlabeled 0 button unavailable.
Unlabeled 0 button.
1 button current. 2 button.
Okay, this seems like a pagination control, but not really knowing what we're paginating. Let's just skip this whole list.
List N. List of 10 items.
Okay.
Link hits as Bible size lock touch on.
Okay.
Radio button not checked 1 of 10. An Amazon hits as Bible.
And so on and so forth, right? And then if we want to navigate by these radio buttons, presumably to find some blueprints that we can use.
Radio button not
Okay.
checked 3 of 10.
Radio button not checked.
See, no labels, right? Now I can do some advanced stuff. I know how to use table navigation keys, so I can navigate by table.
Not in a table. Not in a
Oh,
table.
it's not in a table, so I can't do that either. All right, so basically, you're arrowing down, you're reading all this stuff, you're trying to intuit what is there. It's not that the knowledge might be there, but if the interface does not have these appropriate semantics, this is just a few characters of code to fix. This is a radio button that's missing a label. It's missing an ARIA label by on an ID attribute, right? This is a few minutes to fix. But these kinds of things make really profound have really profound, significant impact in terms of what people are able and not able to do, independent of what they know. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right, give me 1 second. I'm going to switch back to the slides. Sorry for the rustling. There we go. And if you'll permit me, I am not used to it talking this slow, so I have to. That was painful. Much better. Okay. There's this. And then let me do this. And it'll take 20 seconds to re-jitter here because screen readers do not like when you play with their video input. So just give me 1 second and it'll stabilize and I'll be able to drive the slides again. There we go. And then if you guys give me a visual check when they are on the screen. They're on? Cool. Cool beans. Give me 1 second to dismiss the... Okay, are you seeing them? Yes. Perfect, okay. I'll just advance quickly here. It lost my stateful position, but that's okay. I mean, PowerPoint doesn't have any bugs. Okay. Here we go. Almost there. Okay. Thank you for humoring that. Okay. So, we did the demo, and so now some concluding, basically thoughts, right? So, just to sum up a little bit about what we've been talking about. So, there's tons of benefits to this stuff, right? When we think about making our stuff more inclusive, more accessible, it really has a profound impact. It changes the way we think about the user experience. I cannot tell you the number of times we've done something, presumably for one group of users, like keyboard navigation or whatnot. Somebody else comes along and says, I use that feature all the time. I can see perfectly fine. I use that feature all the time. People on the autism spectrum use audio description even though that's for someone who's blind. I think many of us have used captions in a bar or loud environment even though originally that's for deaf and hard of hearing audiences. So this stuff has emergent benefits if we take the time to do it, right? There's regulations that force us to do it as well, right? It's the right thing to do and there are a lot of benefits of doing it up front. Trust me, just real talk, I invoice people both ways. It's cheaper when you do it at the beginning, right? That's reality, right? So, having said that, in terms of closing thoughts, decisions matter. So I wanted to leave us with this and hopefully have a few minutes for Q&A. When Maya Angelou's quote is, when people will forget what you said and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And when we make interfaces, when we make even little like throwaway scripts that we don't think about, it generates a little dashboard or something, that does have an impact on people. We might not know it right now. It might impact us 5-10 years down the road, right? Designing for your future self is another concept that comes out of this work. So just thinking about how the things that we are creating make others feel is at the heart of the work and what I try to get people to think about. With that, I want to just thank you guys for listening and for just thinking about this stuff with me. It really matters, like taking off the speaker/consultant hat. I benefit when you use proper markup, when you use proper HTML, when you think about accessibility. So I want to thank you for that. And if we have time for questions, I'm happy to take anything you got. Definitely. So what are some important resources? WebAIM, WEBAIM.org has some good resources. For example, like if you're interested, how do I make my PowerPoint accessible? How do I make a Word document accessible? What are like the top 5 things like headings, color contrast, that sort of thing? There's a list of resources we always send to clients. I am happy to email that list to Pete if you don't mind distributing it to everybody here as a link blast. That would be awesome. So I'll link to like the WCAG guidelines, ARIA, which is the Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's part of HTML5, of course, now. It has a couple of a color contrast extension in Chrome, so you can just click it right there, see the color contrast issues on any page you're on. The HTML validator at W3C is fantastic. fantastic. Just use that. Validator.w3.org/nu. That is a fantastic validator because it warns you about accessibility issues as well. It doesn't capture everything, but it at least is that low-hanging fruit that you're talking about. And I'll send out some other links with resources on like videos and that kind of thing. Yeah, thank you.
How long did it take you to turn what I thought was a speaker's about to explode, understanding
Yeah.
the words of 1,000 minutes?
So I was a very impatient child, so I kept hitting the faster button. And then there was this other blind kid in school, and he could listen faster than I could, and that wasn't cool. So that, like, a few days later, I was like, great, I'm just cranking this. And so I just literally just kept doing that. I mean, I kept, I had books on tape and stuff as a kid, had speed control on it. So I kept hitting faster and faster. I have an ongoing bet I've never lost with all of my friends, which is that drinks are on me if I cannot get you to read faster with your ears than with your eyes. And it's proven to be, I've always won, because like most people, we can listen pretty quickly. I can get most people to 2x with no problem at all. And if you think about it, 2x is already 300 to 350 words per minute. That's basically the reading level we expect of a college graduate in this country. 2.5x, you're at 400 to 500 words per minute. It's not that hard to get at a pretty high comprehension rate and high speed rate. And you can do it with just like things like podcasts. Just up it a little bit, 1.25, 1.5. If you guys don't know Overcast on iOS, it's a great app. Like it has really good speed controls. And I just tell people, take your favorite podcast, don't slow down. Like be okay with the discomfort a little bit and keep speeding it up. You will get used to it, I promise. And that's kind of the trick for how to do it. Be aware, there's a reason I use this robotic sounding voice like it sounds like it came out in 1985, right? And frankly, it kind of did. Because this thing is math. This is just C code that is generating phonemes. It's a formant synthesizer. What that means is I can crank it. It can talk faster than I can understand. I'm not going to be the limiting, it's not going to be the limiting factor. With human speech, you reach some limits. After about 2.5 to 3x, human speech does not maintain its comprehensibility. So be aware of that if you want to crank it faster than that. Then you start going to artificial speech. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if we could pragmatically, run our HTML, for instance, through tests to make
Yeah.
sure that it's accessible.
100%. Yes, so there's automated testing, but just keep in mind, and this is, again, real talk, because there's companies that will sell you automated testing tools for accessibility. Anything that is good, and they'll tell you, the good ones will tell you, automated testing captures about 20 to 25% of issues. That is if it's operating at its best, okay? 20 to 25, that's a fact of computer science. When we start getting strong AI, we throw some really significant machine learning at it, we can get a little higher. But 20 to 25% is what automated testing gets you. But that's still that's a lot. And it gets you a good 20 to 25%, the important stuff. So they're in Chrome, it's built into that audit tab, so you can go in, click on accessibility right there in DevTools, and run the Lighthouse tools, run the accessibility checker in there. Firefox, you know how there's a web inspector, like you can inspect elements? There's an accessibility inspector built into Firefox. What's cool about that is if you inspect an element, it will tell you the computed accessible name. In other words, it will tell you how your SVG button that's all fancy, that's got that animation hanging off of it as well, will read to a screen reader. You can do all that stuff, just make sure the label exists. And it will tell you that computed accessible name. So those are two things. And then again, running it through a validator. Validated markup is the number one thing. It's so easy to do. You can put it in a grunt task and Travis and whatever, and it's the easiest thing to ensure everybody just writes valid markup. I know it's an easy thing to say. I cannot tell you how much invalid markup I come across on a daily basis. And that has profound implications for accessibility because it means that the browser is not operating off of a well-formed DOM. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Sina, we're going to have to wrap it up.
Sure.
We are over time for the room, but let's give it up one more time.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.